Hey, thank you so much, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually think you're getting a UNC double header today because I understand Maureen also got a degree at DCRP. So I did not know that. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. And let me just jump right into Carl. You're going to show this. There we go. Okay, you can go through the keep going. So I want to first of all just sort of talk a little bit about maybe my own views about some of the, I think, maybe exaggerations or even myths about what's happened to the economy. There's a general narrative that this economy is awful, and leaving aside COVID. Workers in the bottom half of it, they've been losing ground. They make no money. Workers are losing their jobs left and right. Everybody's a Uber driver, and corporations are making a boatload of money. In fact, when you really look at it, when you control for the right kind of inflation, I won't go into details on that. Median wages have been going up about a percentage point a year, a little bit more than that. So the bottom 10% wages have been going up. So the notion is somehow that certainly in the last 20 years, we had a problem in the 80s, and people go back to 1980 and count it. But in the last 20 years, wages have been going up. Now, should they be going up more? Of course. So should productivity. You can go to the next slide. Next slide, sorry. So another thing we hear all the time is that workers are losing their jobs more and more, and everybody's precarious and all. And it's not to say that that's not an issue, but when you look at the data from the BLS, what you find is that the average quarterly job losses, which are essentially from a worker, a company downsizing or closing, so not firing a worker, but downsizing or closing. You can see that that's been going down gradually since 1995 when BLS collected it. And what's really striking to me about this slide is obviously it went way up because of COVID. But now if you look at it where it is now, it's actually back down to where it historically should be. Again, not to say that this, obviously is nicer to have less, but this notion or this mythology out there that technology and globalization are destroying lots and lots of jobs and workers are at risk as never before, that just simply does not appear to be the case. Next slide. The same thing with contingent work. We hear that all the time, and it's partly one of those things where everybody or many people generalize from their own experience. Everybody thinks technology is speeding up because we all have a new iPhone. A lot of people think that a lot of workers are in contingent work because most of us drive or maybe take an Uber or a Lyft ride once in a while. But actually, when you look at the latest BLS surveys from 2017, Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can find that the share of contingent workers has actually gone down. The share of self-employed is at an all-time low in 2016. So most workers are actually at full-time or at least part-time jobs with benefits. Okay, next slide. And then we hear also workers are getting not very good deal, but profits are at all-time levels. It actually simply is not true. When you look at US profits as opposed to profits of US companies overseas, which we fundamentally, who cares what they are, we better, the higher the better. It's not our prices. US non-financial profits are actually lower today as a share of GDP than they were in the sort of heyday of the 40s through the 70s, what's economists call the golden age of worker prosperity. Okay, next slide. I just go back one slide. I'm just add one more thing on that. The prior speaker referred to growth of income inequality by Emmanuel Sayers, and that study's actually been rebutted or disputed by a number of other economists, partly because of how he accounts for households. He accounts for households using tax data, which is not the right way to do it, and he uses incorrect inflators. So I would argue that you shouldn't take that. You should take that with a grain of salt. None of this is to say, by the way, that income inequality hasn't grown. What it is to say is that the notion that a lot of people have now that productivity growth only benefits the rich is simply wrong. It's always been wrong. It continues to be wrong. Productivity growth benefits, on average, the median worker in America. Okay, next slide. The problem is slow productivity growth. Now, I don't have this slide going all the way back, but if you go back to 2008, let's say, what you find is essentially unbelievable drop in US labor productivity growth. So in the 60s, for example, US labor productivity growth was growing about 2.8% a year. It was growing again in 95 to 2008. Since that period to really 2018 was the slowest growth of labor productivity probably in American history. If we want to know why wages aren't growing as fast as they should, this is why. You can't raise wages faster than productivity without inflation, and then you don't really have wage growth. But one of the things that's interesting here, as you see, is that we've seen pretty strong productivity growth in 2020 now. A lot of that was related, the prior speaker talked about a lot of the job loss was in low wage jobs. Low wage jobs are also low productivity jobs. So the economy structurally shifted over to higher, more of the output was in high productivity sectors, which is why we saw that. But that really wasn't the case in the first quarter of 2021, and first quarter of 2021 was pretty good. So that to me suggests a really interesting question. Are we finally on the cusp of stronger productivity growth, perhaps due to these new technologies, which are finally beginning to kick in, like 5G, like robotics, like artificial intelligence? Or are we going to be stuck with another 5-10 years of slow productivity growth, slow wage growth, slow state revenue growth? And we don't know, but what it does suggest is that policymakers should be focused on that question. Next slide. So, not to say that the COVID crisis was not problematic or hard economically, it certainly was. But if you think about how bad it was, I mean, we were shutting down whole parts of the economy. It is amazing that we're not worse off than we are. The prior speaker talked about the state budgets are better. I don't think anybody would have suspected a year ago that state budgets would be as good as they are now. Nobody in early 2020 would have expected that US GDP would have grown 6.2%. US GDP now is bigger than it was before COVID. I mean, it's striking. Now you compare that to the EU, where they haven't had the kind of stimulus packages that we've had. They haven't had the COVID vaccines deployment that we have. Their GDP is down 3.5% over that period. So not to say by any stretch it's Pollyannish, but compared to what we went through, the US economy did pretty well. We still have challenges, obviously, getting that last 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points back into the workforce, but we're doing pretty well compared to all of that. Next slide. However, I think one of the key points on the economy is this is not just a typical sort of recession where you see maybe the stocks of inventory go up or some price shock like oil or something like this. This is a structural shock. And what it means is that certain parts of the economy have permanently, or at least for a long term, collapsed. And other parts of the economy are growing. Now we see that in terms of just the difference between bricks and mortar retail and e-commerce retail. There's going to be a continuation, if not an acceleration of retail mall bankruptcies, of retail bankruptcies, bricks and mortar retail bankruptcies, big, small, medium, you name it. What the COVID crisis did is it put a lot of people who really weren't comfortable buying online. Now they're comfortable, they understand it, they like it, and they'll keep doing it. So that means whole parts of the economy are going to be troubled, and it's going to take a long time for that to work its way through. Same thing with remote work. You see announcements of companies like Google and Facebook and Apple and all these companies that are essentially saying forever, a lot of workers can work remotely. Some of them can even work remotely from any place they want to work in the world, as long as there's connectivity. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But one thing it might mean is potentially suburbs going up. And you've seen this mass of migration out of cities towards suburbs. That's why we have the housing crisis in so many places. You're going to see big downtown, I think, vacancies in real estates, whether that's the restaurants and all of that, is more workers come back to work, but they're not going to come back to work 5 days a week. So that all of those, and they're not going to, and a lot of companies are going to move to what's called hoteling, where they're not going to have all the office space needs that they had in the past. So that means maybe suburbs are going to go up and downtowns are going to shrink. Another important factor of that is the ability for flexible zoning. It may be that we turn shopping malls into new kinds of office parks or schools or whatever. But we're going to have much more flexible policies around land use and building use, because we've gone through this pretty major change in like 1 year, what normally might take 20 years. Same thing with teleconferencing. I don't see business travel on airlines coming back anytime soon. I don't see hotels coming back anytime soon for business travelers. Those are major structural shocks. And lastly, heartland revival. As I said before, you see a lot of companies now saying we don't necessarily need to be in Boston or Silicon Valley, or at least have all of our workers there. So maybe we'll have some in the heartland, a place like Indianapolis or Birmingham, where it doesn't cost as much. We were instrumental in putting a provision in the Senate U.S. Innovation and Competition Act to create a federal competition for technology hubs around the country, where the feds would come in and for 5 years provide a significant amount of money to help places get over the hump to become strong, freestanding technology hubs. Okay, next slide, and then I'm almost done. So what do we need to do? I go back to productivity. At the end of the day, productivity is the core component for helping everybody: low-income workers, medium-income workers, minority workers, women workers, you name it. Without productivity, it's just hard to do that. Right now, we have a lot of low-wage jobs in the economy, way more than we need. We have a lot of workers who work in low-wage jobs who have college degrees. They're there because there aren't any better jobs. And so we need to figure out a way to automate more jobs and then help workers move into those better jobs. And the tax policy is one way to do that. A lot of states have tax incentives for investing in worker skills, in R&D, and actually in new machinery and equipment. I know you had a panel on broadband. We've done a lot of work at ITIF on broadband. Key point there is, in our view, broadband policies by states and locals should be technology neutral. Maybe it's cable, maybe it's fiber, maybe it's wireless, maybe it's satellite. And they should be provider neutral. Sometimes it might be a municipal provider is the right answer, but sometimes oftentimes it's going to be it's a private provider. And lastly, worker programs. All states by federal law are required to allow workers to get training while they're collecting unemployment insurance, and virtually no state does that. I find it really troubling, and I know why states do it. I used to work for a governor. States do it because they don't want to have their UI expenditures go up, and then their UI taxes have to go up. But the reality is, when workers are laid off, that's the best time for them to get retraining, and they can't get retraining, or it's certainly hard to get retraining if you don't provide income support, and UI is a way to do that. So encouraging the UI system to really go out and let workers know and encourage them to get training while they get UI support is critical. And then also training reform. We're not very innovative in this country, frankly, in terms of the kinds of ways to train workers. What we've termed regional skills alliances, getting industries and unions together to lead these new kinds of technical colleges. For example, there's a college in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, it's all about technical skills, 4 years. It's all tied in with what industry needs. They're doing robotics, Internet of Things, et cetera, et cetera. Innovative reemployment web portals. I encourage you to go in your state and go on to the state employment department and look and see, pretend you're an unemployed worker. I think you'll be shocked at how unbelievably bad these systems are. I've done it myself. Let's just put it this way, it's not the Amazon website. A lot of these web portals are clunky. They're not friendly. They don't really help a worker figure out what to do next, where to get their skills. We really need to re-envision those and make them a lot better, to make it easier for workers to get the help that they need, including online help. And I think that might be it. Last slide. Oh yeah, just last thing. If you look at how much the US invests in what are called active labor market policies that before a worker gets laid off and once they're laid off, we're way over there on the left. Only Mexico in the OECD is below us. You look at places like Denmark, Sweden, those places, by the way, they don't worry there about automation. I talked to the head of the Swedish labor union once. He said, we don't worry about our companies adopting too much technology. We worry about them adopting too little. And that's the reason why, if you're in Sweden, you're going to get a lot of support if you're a worker. Last slide. Next slide. So not only do we not spend much, but the amount that we've been spending has been going down. And I think that's it. Great. So thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.